Live. There we are.
Bada bing, bada boom.
Would you like to start us off, Wayne?
Okay. Hello, everyone. This is, I believe, episode 8 of our discussion on Richard Carrier's On the Historicity of Jesus, Why We Have Reason for Doubt, Why We Might Have Reason for Doubt. And this is the Biblical Criticism Book Club. And we're still on Chapter 5, Section 3, Elements of Literary Context. Carrier has the first part of this book divided up into numbered items of background knowledge that people should know before delving into the question of whether it's historical Jesus or not. And item number 44 on that list, in Jewish
Well,
and pagan
we should explain that this last section of chapter 5 is devoted to illustrating the similarities from a literary standpoint between the New Testament and the Christian writings and those of the surrounding and the I should say contemporary area. Sorry to nitpick, but it's for people who haven't been following along closely.
Yeah, if you see on the screen, I'm keeping an outline of the book, and here's some of the points that came up recently: political contexts of the time, the religious and philosophical context of the time, and a lot of the pagan philosophies carried over into the New Testament. And now we're getting into elements of literary context.
And the general thesis has been the similarities between different aspects of Hellenistic culture, Mediterranean culture, which is in common with Christianity, where a lot of claims have been made about the uniqueness of this or that element of Christianity. But they've all had precedence. It's definitely a product of its cultural and historical milieu.
And to add also that anyone who would argue against Carrier's thesis would have to bring up evidence to show more or less that there are no similarities, such as the ones that he's delineating in this and previous sections. And with that, we move on to element 44.
Now, this section I thought was one of the more interesting sections.
Yeah, I actually remember liking this one.
In Jewish and pagan antiquity, in matters of religious persuasion, fabricating stories was the norm, not the exception, even in the production of narratives purporting to be true. I highlighted in the chapter here, he talks about, first, the Jewish Apocrypha. Even the Maccabean literature contains a lot that is dubious and hardly trusted as more than historical fiction. But collections like the Enochic literature are obvious wholesale fabrications.
This is important, especially when we're talking about the Maccabean literature, because the Maccabean literature in particular purports to illustrate a historical, unmistakable, incontrovertible, let's say, period in history. But Carrier is correct to demonstrate that the actual texts themselves are not historical in the sense that we've come to expect historical, let's say, to me. So yeah, they're talking about a historical period, which is undoubtedly a historical period. But even in that context, the texts and the writings themselves take the form that was normative for Judaic writings of the time, which is storytelling.
Yet the most out of the 4 Maccabean books, only one Maccabees is even considered quasi-historical. The rest are not considered have any kind of relationship to actual history. Some of it is clearly fantasy weaving, fantastic tales kind of thing. But one Maccabees is still considered that there's some nuggets of actual history in them, but that's also been embellished, as Leon said.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's the importance of Carrier starting with the apocryphal text. But then he goes on to list, books in the Old Testament, the Talmud. He goes on to mention the ascension of Isaiah, Tobit. He mentions a whole bunch of them. I don't have it in front of me, but I know he goes through a whole litany of them.
Yep.
And it's pretty. His argument is, I think, pretty sound.
Yeah. There's another section I highlighted in this chapter. I didn't mean to cut you off, Leon.
It's okay.
But on page 217, Carrier writes, a classic example of this trend is seen in the phenomenon of euhemerization, element 45. Thus, lives of non-historical demigods were written as if they actually existed and could be placed in history, and one could argue about which stories about them were true and which false, even though in fact they never existed at all, and so all stories about them were false. A good example of this is Plutarch's biography of Romulus. This was a Roman adoption of the Greek demigod who later was associated with some of the founding legends of the Roman people. His Greek origins by then completely forgotten. Yet Plutarch saw fit to write a straightforward historical biography about him, in which he ponders what stories are true and what are false, and includes this alongside biographies of actual persons, such as Alexander the Great or Julius Caesar, written in exactly the same style.
Correct. We're actually touching on element 45 as well, by the way.
Yeah. Yeah, he cites that in the paragraph here, but yeah.
This is tangentially related to a recent post that I've been seeing on the Geeks listeners page, where people have been commenting on whether Carrier's characterization of euhemerization is an accurate one.
It means doing what euhemerists did.
Well, that is Carrier's
right. Yeah.
That is Carrier's interpretation of it, and I also believe that he's right. But I'm pointing out the fact that people have been disputing that.
Yeah.
But on the group there, that's an old question that was brought up quite a while ago. So it's just as people come in and they're only joining the conversation at a later time, is that it keeps coming up. Some of these questions keep returning. But yeah, at first I thought, wait a minute, that can't be right. But then I read one of his blog posts that he directly answered it. So I don't have the link available, but anybody that wants to go to his Free Thought blog can find it probably with a search, where he goes into detail about what he meant and why he's not actually misusing it. So, but I get tired of pointing people to that stuff,
But I think it's also funny. It's really funny how he basically puts it in a nutshell, really concisely says, it is doing what euhemerists did, basically, period.
Yep. What's the
well,
noise?
The thing is, the people, when they argue it, is the exact opposite of what it means, and I just don't understand. If you know what it means, if you take the time to look up the definition, then what you just wrote is the opposite of what it means. So,
Yeah,
I don't think the fault lies with Carrier on that.
Yeah, I'm often puzzled by things like that.
Yeah.
But anywho, moving along.
Yeah. I want to read something else from this section on Carrier's book. This is on page 219. A great deal of ancient biography, even of real people, was constructed of myth and fiction, frequently telescoping things a person said or wrote into entire fake stories about things they did or that were done to them, even in the most incredible ways. This has been shown for the ancient biographies of historical poets and philosophers, whose entire biographies are almost wholly made up, based loosely on their writings rather than any kind of biographical sources. For example, Euripides' marital troubles were invented based on things different characters say about marriage in his plays, and not on anything that had actually happened to do with the actual Euripides or sources about his life.
Right.
That reminds me of that. I can't think of the main title of one of recent books by Crossan, where it was like how the sayings of Jesus became stories about Jesus. It's kind
Yeah,
of
I
like the
have that.
same
I should have
thing.
written
Yeah,
it. Yeah.
yeah. Isn't that basically the same idea as what he's getting at here?
I haven't finished reading Crossan, so I don't know.
Is it in parables, or which one is it?
Yeah,
I was
parable.
going to look up the exact title here. Hold on.
Because he's got a couple of them on this topic. One of them is called In Parables. Another one is called
How parables about Jesus became parables by Jesus, or something, or
Yeah,
no.
it's
No,
called The Power of
I keep saying it backwards. The power parable. How parables by Jesus became parables about Jesus.
Yeah. Actually, how fiction by Jesus became fiction about Jesus.
Okay.
So I don't know. I guess he was a
there's an
prolific
earlier
fiction
one.
writer.
There's the first one on this topic that he wrote that I read is a really short one called the Dark Interval, which is a really good book actually, but it's really short. But I think it's the first time he brought this topic up. I've been a reader of Don Crossan for a long time. I even had the honor of meeting him.
Yeah.
And that's the first thing when I read that section, the first thing I thought of, because I had read like parts of it, because I don't have that book, but I had read it at a library at one point.
Yeah. Sorry to quote so much out of this chapter, but there's stuff I've highlighted here I'd like to read in.
No, it's all good. I appreciate it actually.
Carrier quoted James Crossley in his Against the Historical Plausibility of the Empty Tomb Story and the Bodily Resurrection of Jesus in Journal for the Study of Historical Jesus 3, June of 2005. And the quote is, "It should seem blindingly obvious that people invent stories, and the sifting of fact from fiction, or fiction from fact, has been one of the most notable features in the history of critical biblical scholarship. So if we are going to take Christianity seriously in its Jewish and pagan contexts, then we must expect the gospel writers to make up stories just as Jews and pagans did. Historically speaking, it is extremely unlikely that the Christians behind the gospel traditions were immune to this standard practice."
Yeah, there's a great irony to be found there in the fact that, for lack of a better word, apologists seem to think that taking the New Testament seriously means to think that it's word for word literal. It's
To take it as history rather than
to take it as
else.
history than to take it as either figurative or allegory or narrative mimesis or anything of that nature. As soon as you actually try to compare it or make an analog with contemporary literature of the time, they think that you're insulting it. And it's really weird to encounter that in scholarship, I think.
And then what Carrier says at the very end of this section is probably one of the most cutting things I've heard. No, that's not even the right term, but I mean one of the harshest things I've heard him say about religion, actually. And I know he said a lot of harsh things. There were in fact over 40 different gospels written, of which even fundamentalists agree only the canonical 4 are in any way authentic, while most mainstream scholars entertain the possibility that only 1 or 2 of these are at best authentic, plus over half a dozen different acts. Examples of this fabricatory activity in the early Christian faith literature are vast in quantity. This was clearly the norm, not the exception. Most of what Christians wrote were lies. Therefore, we should approach everything they wrote with distrust.
You can almost, from the earlier arguments in this section, you can almost say that about all the literature, because he's practically saying that you can't find a single example from ancient history where fact, fable, and fiction are interwoven to such an extent that, you know, you could almost say that very little actual history exists in any of that stuff, in the entire body of literature. But he specifically says, mainly at first in the beginning, Jewish faith literature. So what he's saying is basically everything that was written. That includes the, you know, not only the canonical stuff, but the pseudepigrapha and everything else, and even like the midrashic stuff, the Haggadah stuff, you know, all that is almost purely fantasy. He almost comes out and says that almost none of it's, you know, in any way remotely true. And that's the norm.
That quote gets an amen from me, and in addition to that, I can't wait for the day where scholarship actually finally reaches this level of honesty.
Yeah, because they can almost say that, and yet they don't explore the implications of that. You know, they don't take it to the next step.
Well,
I didn't say that.
Yeah, they're working off the sort of the model that you can have, you know, indefinite, you know, infinite number of layers of fiction on top of you know, historical core. But we'll never kind of turn the telescope around and wonder if perhaps the stories became the memory.
Yeah, I like the metaphor that Price uses in his book, The Incredible Shrinking Set of Man. You know, kind of like an onion in a way, but, you know, every time we peel off things that are obviously fiction, you know, or obvious exaggeration, we peel another layer off. We examine the next layer, and it looks like it's also, you know, an obvious fabrication.
And we get
to the center of the onion, and there's like nothing left.
Oh, I'd like to add here that this is one place or one subject or topic, let's say, where the principle of analogy is crucial, because what Carrier is trying to do is bring in the principle of analogy. In other words, to look at to survey the literature of the time, which would have influenced the writing of the New Testament, and to compare it with it. And so it's not any kind of antagonism towards the Bible. It's not any kind of antagonism towards supernatural. It's just the principle of analogy. That's all.
Yep.
I need to step away for like 2 minutes.
We'll be timing you.
So we should we read the next one? Or do you have another quote that you'd like to read?
I'm in the next chapter, next element now.
45?
Yep. Which is short. I could probably just read the entire element here while we're waiting for John to get back.
Well,
Element 45. A popular version of this phenomenon in ancient faith literature was the practice of euhemerization, the taking of a cosmic god and placing him at a definite point in history as an actual person who was later deified. We already noted Plutarch's criticism of the trend, which he frowns upon, but in doing so concedes its popularity in element 14. Euhemerus was a Greek writer of the early 3rd century BCE who wrote a book called The Sacred Scriptures, in which he depicted an imaginary scholar discovering that Zeus and Uranus were once actual kings. In the process, Euhemerus invents a history for these god kings, even though we know there is no plausible case to be made that either Zeus or Uranus was ever a real person. Yet the idea caught on. Biographies and histories of non-existent people proliferated, and ancient literature flowered with attempts to assign mythic heroes and gods to real historical periods and places. Even before that, there were attempts to develop a historical Hercules to justify territorial disputes in the Peloponnesus, or Peloponnesus, I never know how to pronounce that. And afterwards, the origin of Rome was explained by appealing to an eponymous godman named Romulus, and many other uses were found for the procedure, as we saw for inventing King Arthur, Ned Ludd, Abraham, Moses, and other national heroes I explored in Chapter 1. There was nothing at all unusual about doing this.
Wait, did he just say that we all know that Zeus couldn't have possibly existed? That's blasphemy.
Yeah, I know.
Well, yeah, prove any god doesn't exist.
No.
Sorry, I had to insert my own little moment of sarcasm.
No.
So there's a good definition of euhemerization there at the beginning of element 45. I think that's really it in a nutshell. If you can understand that, then you should have no problem.
Yeah, it makes me wonder why people are making such a weird deal out of it, but oh well.
I think what confuses them is that because they're mixing up the original cosmic Jesus who was historicized with now the historical Jesus deified. To them that's where they get confused. We are on 45, right? Okay.
Yeah, I just finished reading.
He just read the element in its entirety because it's short enough.
Very well then, let's move on.
Element 46. Ancient literature also proliferated a variety of model hero narratives, some of which the Gospel of Jesus conforms to as well. And one of these hero types was widely revered among pagans, the pre-Christian narratives of the life and death of Socrates and Aesop. And I have to admit I have not read those, so I can't tell you much about them.
You've never read the Apology and the Phaedo and Plato's writings on the death of Socrates?
I need to. I never have. Sorry.
Oh, dude, they're kind of essential reading in a way. I really recommend them.
Yeah.
Yeah, that the death of Socrates is like is an archetype, and I read it years ago. I haven't read it recently, but it was like when I did, it was very it left its mark. Yeah. Just reading it.
I'm going to edit this outline and paste something into here. Oh, look, it's not going to. It doesn't paste nice when I do this though. This program.
Undo.
Yeah.
Or actually, what you should do is Shift Enter. Undo first of all.
Yeah, I know.
You got it.
Yeah.
Shift Enter should do it.
I know what I should do. I should go and turn off my screen share for a moment. Go back to my screen share, and
Microsoft Word works real weird when you do that. If you have a paragraph that's numbered, you hit Enter, and it creates a new number. As soon as you click Control-Z or Undo, it just undoes the numbering but leaves the paragraph there.
No, the problem is the way this PDF is formatted. There's hard line breaks in it. So every time the lines wrap, there are hard breaks, and the outline is going to renumber them for every line, not every item.
Oh, right.
So that I have to fix it manually whenever I do this. I don't want to do that right now. So I just switched my screen share over to the other document. So this is the actual PDF.
Okay.
But here are some of the things he lists. They all came from a humble background. Socrates was the son of a stonemason. Aesop was a slave. Yet all were exalted as a moral hero and exemplary man who was in the right and whose teachings one ought to follow. And that's...
Wait. Oh, I was just saying we probably shouldn't read all of them if we want to finish quickly.
Okay.
Yeah. Just for interests of brevity and stuff like that.
I thought they'd be worth talking. I didn't push in the outline before, though, because I didn't think they were as important as what's coming up. But I did post the other list that Carrier has.
But the point being that...
what do they call that? I'm sorry, go ahead, Leah.
The point being to highlight the similarities in the narrative style of some of these some of the popular, undoubtedly, unmistakably popular, similar, I guess, what's the word I'm looking for? Exemplars of this kind of story.
Yeah. So do we agree on all 18 of these points, that these are parts of this archetype?
I tend to say yes. I think that he's correct in making these parallels, and I think there are those, such as Daniel and others, who think that that Carrier makes too much of the similarities with the mystery religions, and I won't go as far as, I don't know what his feeling on Carrier's highlighting of these similarities, but I would say that the similarities are pretty stark, and that it would, the burden of proof would be on someone who would deny.
Yeah. And this is the main list that Carrier's going with. This is one he's given before he gives the other list.
Yeah, because this is the parallels with Romulus. Yeah, this, as far as like the scholars like Daniel might be representing, is this doesn't even exist. You know, this is like irrelevant. But what they really like to concentrate on is that rank wrangling. I think I'm pronouncing, which is in the next. Yeah. So, you know, I don't want to spend too much time on this particular part. I really want to discuss the other.
Okay, we can do that.
More in depth, but, you know, only because very little credence is, anytime you bring up parallels, they get all glassy-eyed and stuff, you know, even if it seems to be very convincing.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, see, from my view, that's their problem.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, I'm going to stop sharing this list. Anybody who wants to read the rest of it can pause the video later on.
Yeah, I almost, you know, wish that we would spend more time, but we can never guarantee whether we're going to have the Hangout or not, so, you know.
So, where are we at now?
Element 47.
Okay.
Yeah, the rank Raglan. Raglan?
Let me see if, yeah.
Or is this the one where he matches like 20 out of the 25 or whatever?
Yeah, and the reason I think I wanted to talk about this the most is because there's a couple of points I want to bring up, because I can see some of the objections to this list. And I just wanted to talk with you guys, see what you guys think.
I'm getting a little tongue-tied reading here. Somebody else want to read for me now at this point?
Sure. I'll read this one. Element 47. Another model hero narrative, which pagans also revered, and to which the gospel Jesus also conforms, is the apotheosis, or ascension to godhood tale. And of these, the one to which the Gospels and the Acts most conform is that of the Roman traditional hero Romulus. Should I go down the line on these?
I was planning on us doing it. If John objects, then we might not want to, but...
It's like 10:30 already in my time. But if you read the book, then you're, you know, and also been following the discussion online, you know, you should be at least familiar with the contents of it. And it's basically we can maybe just explain what they are and succinctly, is that there's 20 to 22 criteria.
Well, in a similar sense that someone like Joseph Campbell can delineate general principles that
the hero's journey,
myths usually take, and that this myth that is common to most societies usually takes a form that is that has common features, let's say.
What really irks me, though, is that, you know, in his own field of comparative mythology, what a stature this guy has. But outside, when you try to apply that kind of scholarship to a different area, then it's like people feel free to denigrate the guy who's no longer alive, Campbell.
Really?
who's no longer alive. Well, a lot of what he says is not considered applicable to New Testament because of the hidden agendas of apologetics that wants this stuff to be not comparable to
Right,
other
of course.
mythologies.
Of course, but that's why it behooves us to take these people on and to
And it
challenge.
rankles me. Yeah, that really
Yeah,
rankles me because
because
when
it's
I first
exactly
heard
what
of
he's
him.
talking about.
Yeah, when I first heard of him, I thought, "Whoa, what a great guy! What a fantastic mind this guy is!" And to see him, poo-pooed or shrugged off as being irrelevant, really just. Ugh.
I would welcome, if anyone who's not necessarily an apologist, but an historicist wishes to poo-poo this kind of scholarship, I would welcome you to bring it on.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let's just then get into a general discussion, at least, about the 22 criteria, and there's more that he mentions that he's just going to have this, basic 22 list.
Well, there's 20 on this list, I believe.
And he adds two more, 21
okay.
and 22, yeah. Which, I don't know exactly. I thought he said there was actually more. But anyway, my big question is...
22 is on element 48.
Right.
So there's 3 different lists here.
Okay. Which element are we on?
47.
47, okay. And I skipped ahead a bit. Yeah, because 47 is the Romulus and Jesus parallels list, right?
The ascension to godhood tale list, basically, yes.
Okay. And so the list that he gives in 47 is that he starts out, but when taken together, the Romulus and Jesus death and resurrection narratives contain all the following parallels. So it's a list of parallels between the two, correct?
Yeah.
And that's something I really didn't want to get into because I wanted to move on to 48 and do the rank Raglan thing.
Okay.
So if you don't mind.
Yeah, we can move on.
That's cool. Because my big question about this list, okay. Disregarding what I've read, other apologists and that that are criticizing Carrier's application of this. My big question is, if you have a set of criteria that you've extrapolated from myths, doesn't that kind of... Because Carrier's point is that there's in this list there's no historical person that's ever cast this. That these, when you try to apply this to known historical people, they always achieve such a low ranking on this list that they don't even appear or something like that. So isn't it, if you extrapolate this purely from one point of view, doesn't that by definition, it's almost like non-falsifiable, where it's guaranteed not to turn up any false positives, where you have actual historical people showing up on this list of these criteria?
Well, what Carrier is saying was nobody who's historical gets even more than half of these items.
And I'm wondering if it's possible to say that there's a problem with that.
It would be. I think that, I don't know if I agree with you, because it would be falsifiable if you could produce one single example of someone.
But he says there has never been. He says that's exactly what happens. There's never been one example of an actual historical person.
And if you could, I mean, the falsifiability entails, describing what would falsify the theory, right? And what would falsify the theory would be an example of someone who was actually a living biological historical entity, who would pass this gauntlet of descriptors, let's say, right?
Right.
Maybe if we wait long enough, maybe if we wait long enough, the dictator of North Korea might pass.
No, yeah, but my point is not that falsifiability means that you present such a case. Is that the falsifiability entails that there is a way to falsify something.
Okay, yeah, all right, I get you. So it's not that it's not falsifiable, because obviously it is, but like you said, there's so far just never been a case of it, but that doesn't mean it's not falsifiable.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, the when Popper talks about falsifiability, he's talking about, for instance, I'll give you an example of falsifiability, right? What would falsify the theory of evolution with regards to the fossil record and sedimentation? Well, what would falsify it is, for instance, if we were in a Cambrian period and we found jackrabbit bones,
Exactly.
right?
Yeah.
That would falsify it, right? But
Right.
that doesn't mean that we have to find jackrabbit bones in the Cambrian period in order to prove that this is so. In other words, it's impossible. We're saying it's impossible, and in order to show that it's not impossible, you would have to produce some jackrabbit bones in the Cambrian layer.
Yeah. It's a prediction of the theory is that the jackrabbit bones are not in the Cambrian. Finding them in the Cambrian would refute a
Would
prediction
falsify
of the theory.
it, yes.
Yeah.
And so I don't think that you're reading this correctly, John.
No, I'm just not understanding it correctly. So, have you guys read any of the objections to Carrier's use of this list at all?
No, but if
I'm willing to hear them. I haven't, but I'm willing to hear them.
I'd like to hear some.
I didn't really want to read those, not because I didn't want to hear, contrary opinions, but I wanted to read it and try to work through it without any other influences, just looking at his arguments.
The only major objection I've heard that really comes to mind is that, insofar as the Jesus story kind of influenced other stories through human history, the list becomes kind of, or the criteria becomes kind of circular. Because, in that, fictional people, based on this very widespread Jesus archetype would then lead to the development of these 20 criteria or however many, which then would not appropriately be put all the way back to Jesus. That's the only objection I've heard.
I'm not following that because most of the examples for this archetype are pre-Jesus.
Yeah, I agree in your case, but I've heard that. In popular responses, I've seen it misperceived that the examples are post Jesus, but
it seems to me that the objection that you're mentioning is special pleading, though, because you're saying, well, not you, but the people who are making the objection are saying something along the lines of, well, that's not fair because you're taking all these fictional characters, right? And by definition, they're fictional characters, and so it doesn't apply because it's special pleading because you're going, but in our case, Jesus was real, and so he wouldn't fit this category, and which is why it's so crucial that falsifiability kind of is factored into this. In other words, if you want to complain about it, that's great. So demonstrate. Well, you could falsify this right now, right? Show me an actual biological historical individual who passes this Raglan gauntlet of requisites, right? And then boom, and then you could if you can show me one person, then it's not just Jesus, is it?
I think the other thing that it brings up is like if you look at historical people, that they score so low on this scale compared to like Jesus and other known fictional or mythical people.
Yeah, like I'm sure someone like Alexander is kind of famous and venerated high enough to at least score a couple of points on this list, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think as I understand Carrier's argument, the assignment or the scoring of a person on this on these criteria as a first step, it gives you the first stage of that probability. But I think Carrier would then say, well, even if Alexander the Great scored, let's say, a 10 or something, well, okay, other things being equal, you might think that Alexander was a mythical figure, but then once we review everything else that comes through history, then his probability goes way, way up. I think he's using this as basically a valid assignment to a first reference class, as he puts
Yeah,
it.
but it must also be emphasized that even Alexander, who's a venerated figure in the past, does not fit all of these.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. It's just that would be a what I'm saying is that would be the when you hear someone say, oh well, even people who are historical, of whom you could find examples who are venerated and might score some hits, that's still only the first step in establishing historicity.
Correct.
It's like the first elements of the first variable in that equation.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yes. Correct.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people like to argue that everything rests on this one point, but like Jim pointed out, there's a lot more to it. I mean, this is just one area.
Yeah.
So there's other actual historical evidence that you can also bring into archaeological, that kind of stuff, literary things like that. So yeah, and that cumulative body establishes a lot these people as historical as opposed to mythical.
Yeah.
Again, this is a place where the principle of analogy is really important.
Yeah.
Anybody have anything else to add to that?
There's only one place here so far where I've actually highlighted a footnote in Carrier's book where I wanted to read the entire footnote, but it's a very long one though. It takes up most of the whole page actually. But it's footnote
Go ahead.
It's footnote 187. A mathematical objection is sometimes raised here, using the Lincoln-Kennedy coincidences as a counterexample.
Yeah, I always thought this was really funny.
Yeah. Can you explain to people what the Lincoln-Kennedy coincidences are? I don't have them memorized offhand.
I don't have them memorized offhand either, but I can kind of touch on it a little bit. Lincoln. Oh gosh, this is probably easy enough to Google. Hold on.
Lincoln had a secretary named Kennedy, and Kennedy had a secretary named Lincoln, something like that.
They had a secretary named Lincoln, and
He was
Kennedy
shot
was
in a
riding
car.
Kennedy was in a car that was a Lincoln Continental.
Yeah, all that weird stuff.
Yeah. The reason
things along that sort.
The reasoning being that there clearly is no causal relation in that case. Therefore, large lists of coincidences can occur by chance, an example of multiple comparisons fallacy. However, this is an invalid analogy for two reasons. First, the coincidences in the Lincoln-Kennedy case are all trivial and meaningless, and most have no conceptual connection with each other. Moreover, some are actually false. The number of true coincidences is only 15. Second, the amount of available data on Lincoln and Kennedy is vast compared to the data on Romulus and Jesus or any other ancient person, mythical or historical, due to the enormous disparity in the survival of sources and documents from the two periods. Combine those two conditions and the likelihood of a long list of parallels occurring purely by chance is high, since no rules govern which parallels count, and there are so many data points, so the frequency of random parallels is high. But when neither condition obtains, the frequency is not high. In the Romulus-Jesus case, the probability is extremely low that the filter destroying almost all the data about them would just by coincidence preserve 20 meaningful and substantial parallels, conceptually connected to each other, to each of their death and resurrection accounts. The Lincoln-Kennedy coincidences are often highly likely to occur between any two people. Millions of people have had the same number of letters in their name, for example, whereas the Romulus-Jesus parallels are not. How many people are hailed Son of God? How many have the world covered by supernatural darkness How many have the world covered by supernatural darkness at their deaths? How many have their corpses conspicuously vanish? How many visit their friends on the road from their city in a resurrected body to commission them to spread their gospel, etc.? Thus, even with a large database, 20 such parallels would be unlikely. It is only the more so with so small a database. Most of the Lincoln-Kennedy coincidences have, again, no conceptual connection to each other. What has the year of a man's birth to do with the nature of his death? But the Romulus-Jesus parallels do. All relate to describing the narratives of their deaths and the religious aftermath directly connected thereto. Thus, the ability to find connected data points, unconstrained by any parameters, does not obtain in the later case, greatly reducing the probability of even trivial parallels, much less substantial ones.
Yeah, that was a fun part of the story, but to me, it's like that this would even come up is like I wouldn't have had somebody brought that up in a discussion or something. I'd be just like, what? What does that have to do with it?
I agree with this, John, but I'm struck, and it reminds me of people who bring up things like the flat Earth theory or hypothesis or whatever you want to call it. It's so hard to you can go, well, it's so hard to knock such a stupid theory down because it's so stupid that you're looking at endless details that are held up as examples and are so trivial and so inconsequential, but nevertheless there's so many of them and they're at least superficially in other words, and I think this has to do with the recent findings of neuroscience and cognitive science, that human beings are really, really, really good at finding patterns, even if they're superficial, trivial patterns, and even when patterns are not really there. But I think as Carrier, as in the quote that Wayne just cited, as Carrier has pointed out, that's not the case in what we're talking about here.
Yeah, the key word there is trivial. I think that really sums it up.
It's kind of like, okay, yeah, Lincoln, Kennedy was shot in a car that was a Lincoln Continental. What the hell does that have to do with anything?
Yeah. As far as the flat Earth guys go, most of the flat Earth YouTubers, they're in an echo chamber where they do these videos. They have their little, explain this, and it just goes one way. They don't, they might get criticism, but they don't have to really answer it. There's only one or two guys that actually try to debate it as if they were scientists. Mm-hmm. And all it really comes down to is I just don't agree with you. I just don't accept what you're saying as any kind of fact.
Right.
So you always reach that point where you just can't go any further because they just refuse to give up a core set of things that makes their point of view valid to them.
Did you pay attention to the recent Neil deGrasse Tyson episode with a famous rapper who's trying to revive the flat Earth theory, so to speak? It's really funny.
Like a year ago, you didn't even hear about it, and all of a sudden now it's tons of videos of these people just coming out of the woodwork.
Yeah, I know. It's really bizarre. And the thing, the really funny thing about this whole thing, though, is that people like McGrath will point to stuff like that and go, you see, that's just like mythicism, and it's just infuriating, because here we're talking about, evidence as being put forth for potential opponents to examine, right? And people like McGrath are not even bothering to engage it, I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, it's hard to go on.
Yeah. Yeah, here is where he has 22 items, and then he goes on to list who he believes, or who scholars say fit these items most, and how many items they fit. So there's a list. Oedipus fits the most of them, fitting 21 of them. And then Moses and Jesus were tied at 20 each. But actually, it's arguably, Jesus might fit 22 of them, arguably. A couple of them are depending on how you define things.
Yeah, the most I've ever heard the criticisms, and like I said, I tried to stay away from them so far. I'll probably, after this, go actually look at them. But from what I recall, is most of them, like, the big problem they have is that, okay, the criteria, like any given one of these 20 to 22, if you apply that to Jesus, well, it only applies a little bit or a certain way, or, you know, if it's not an exact fit, then they want to disregard the entire point, so that keeps lowering Jesus' score, or any of these guys' score. If you insist on like a 1-to-1, 100% correspondence to everything, rather than what like Dr. Price has argued over the years about types, you know, there are certain types of stories, certain types of thought and stuff like that that only has to correspond broadly in order to be considered something of that type.
Yeah,
Right, yeah.
Bellerophon should be part of this type.
Is
You
it-
only use these criteria.
If the story of Jesus was exactly like the story of Romulus, then we would be telling the story of Romulus, not the story of Jesus.
Yeah,
That's
then
how
they wouldn't have any argument whatsoever.
Right, exactly. And so typology, when we're using typology, we're not looking for exact matches. We're looking for types.
Yeah, and that's always the argument the counter argument you get, not only in this, but say like in form or source form criticism, or whatever the other one is, I can't think of it now. But anyway, yeah, it's always, it has to conform. You know, that's not close enough of a match. You know.
And the answer to that is yes, it is. When you engage with the actual concept of typology, yes, it is.
Oh yeah, I definitely agree with you on that.
So I'll speed this along by skipping through some of this stuff and going to the latter part of this outline for the chapter.
All right, guys, I'm sort of hitting bedtime for me, so I'm gonna have to sign off for now.
Okay, sorry, Jim.
Yeah,
Good
we
having you.
appreciate you coming.
I appreciate it. I learn from you guys.
Yeah, we were getting really close to wrapping up here, actually, though. But
Yeah, I'm
good
hoping
night.
maybe 6 minutes.
yeah, something like that. Yeah.
He just split anyway, so.
Okay. No known historical persons are on this list. Only mythical people ever got fitted into this hero type. This in itself is evidence that the phenomena is not mere coincidence, else more real people would by chance also fit the pattern.
Oh, that's something I missed.
Well, that's kind of what we were talking about, how people accuse it of being circular and accuse it of being ad hoc and unfalsifiable, but I think we've already been talking about how that's not the case, and he's just basically kind of bringing that to a head here.
You know, some of those tests for, like, they used to try to conduct for psychic ability, where they'd have one person look at a card and have the other person try to psychically connect to figure out what the card the person is looking at. And a lot of people will say, okay, you should have already guessed a certain amount right, statistically, right?
Right.
So when he says something like, statistically, there should have been historical people on this list and they're not, that was probably what had set me off on thinking about, the possibility that this is kind of a circular type. If you extrapolate a list of criteria only from mythical people, then you're never going to have anybody but mythical people on that list. That's, I think, what Jim was trying to get at earlier.
But except for Jesus, he's the only one. That's special pleading.
Yeah, because it would have to be more than just one, statistically speaking.
That's the point.
So that pretty much wraps it up for me then. you know,
Yeah.
that kind of erases any kind of doubt I had.
The only two elements Jesus does not score on the list are the last listed. We could not establish 21 that his parents were originally imagined as related, or 22 that he ever married, much less the daughter of his predecessor.
Well, some might say that.
Yeah. So, and then I had a couple points I grabbed out for the conclusion of this whole chapter on background knowledge. The point of this and the previous chapter has been to summarize all the facts we must take into account as being in our total background knowledge when assigning all probabilities going forward. In my experience, a great deal of what has been surveyed up to this point remains unknown even to many experts in the study of Jesus. But all of it must be taken into account by anyone who wishes to reconstruct the historical Jesus or the origins of Christianity. And those are direct words from Carrier in this book, direct quotes.
Yeah, I think we've been touching on, as we go, we've been basically touching on this all along, and I think obviously we've already said it before, but I think I see Carrier's argument as sound and valid.
And it has a cumulative effect. I mean, you know, he's saying that everything from elements from the political context, the philosophical, religious, through the literary context, when you take all that into account, that just makes the argument that much stronger. Yeah. And you cannot isolate any one, like you can say, well, it's invalid because I have problems with Frank Raglan. You know, because it's not just that. It's just not literary context. It's also political context. It's archaeology, all that stuff.
Now, well, Carrier actually hasn't began his argument yet. He's just setting forth things that he wants to be established before he begins the argument.
Yeah, he basically this until now this has all been kind of introductory.
Yep.
And then at this point for the next chapter, he will begin to apply the principles he set forth in the first book of Proving History onto this particular case.
Yeah, and in the olden days, people just would argue about opinions, you know, and agree on the facts at least. Nowadays, you have to go through half the book just to establish the facts, that, you know, to try to eliminate disagreement. Because, you know, you'll never get anywhere because people are arguing about, well, that's not true, that's not even evidence or something like that.
Yeah.
Well, it's a good testament on the progress of scholarship.
Yeah. And we said this before, but I want to say it again. I really like how Carrier numbers these and sets them aside separately so they can be argued without getting lost in the text.
And it's nice to have hyperlinks that you can just read it in a pop-up.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's part of...
If somebody has one of those kind of texts.
I think it's part of the importance of his work. So, cool. I think we should probably just leave it here then. And
we should decide how much we're going to do for next Hangout.
You have the book in front of you. I don't.
Yeah, I think we just do Chapter 6 next time.
Yeah, it goes from page 235 to what?
253.
So that's not a lot. But it's meaty stuff, though, because it does get into the
no, yeah, it's we're starting
aspect.
We start to get into some of the mathematical concepts, and I think that we should probably not bite too much.
Yeah.
Well, we could say Chapter 6, but if we don't go through the whole thing, that at least that's set out like a goal.
Yeah. And since the character of this book changes at this point, the character of my outline will also change. I'm going to use more of my own summarizing and my own notes on what he's talking about rather than just direct quotes from Carrier.
Cool.
As we proceed here. And I've also started putting page numbers on the outline here for these different things down, if you see here.
Cool. And actually, I've said it before, and I'm going to say it one more time. Wayne, thank you for taking the time to do this
really
outline.
Yeah,
because it's been a great help throughout this whole discussion.
Yeah, thank you.
Where's the part about Betty Crocker? That was the most interesting part of Chapter 6.
That's in 235 to 238.
Okay, cool. We got it covered.
Wait, Betty? Does that mean that Julia Childs is not real? No, never mind.
She was unreal.
There's actual videos of Betty Crocker. What are you talking about?
No, there's actually pictures of the Pillsbury Doughboy. What are you talking about?
That's a good point. That's a good point.
Stay Puft Marshmallow Man.
Yeah.
We know about him.
Mm.
All right.
Tony the
Alrighty.
Tiger. Yeah.
Well, let's call an end to it. And
Yeah.
thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. Thanks to everybody who participated.
Yeah.
And
See
we'll
ya
see you next time.
Yeah.
next time. Yes. Bye-bye.
Bye.